Hey everyone, I'm Olivér Kovács, a Hungarian composer. This is the 5th episode of my video lesson series, How to Compose Music from Scratch. In this lesson we'll learn about non-harmonic tones, borrowed chords, and I'll demonstrate how to compose simple piano pieces. Let's get started. Non-harmonic tones are notes in the melody that briefly step out of the chord. For example, a C major triad consists of the notes C, E, and G. If the melody includes a D or an F, those notes are considered non-harmonic tones. These notes create tension and resolution, making melodies more captivating. A step is when the melody moves to the next note by a minor or major second. A skip is a larger interval greater than a major second. A passing tone is a step towards the next note outside the current triad's notes. A neighboring tone is a step in the opposite direction than the next note outside the current triad's notes. A suspension is a note that briefly stays in its original position and then steps to the next note. A retardation keeps the note's position and then steps upward. An escape tone steps in the opposite direction than the next note and then skips to the next note. An anticipation steps to the next chord's note and then remains in the same position. A neighbor group, also called changing tones, consists of two non-harmonic tones, one a step above and one a step below a chord tone. There are two terms we should clarify before moving to the next section. Diatonic notes belong to the scale, while chromatic notes are outside of it. For example, D is a diatonic note in C major, while D flat is a chromatic note. Now let's briefly talk about borrowed chords. These are chords taken from outside the key you're working in, and they can add some interesting color to your progressions. Here are a few common types. Secondary dominant chords temporarily tonicize a chord other than the tonic. Remember, the tonic is the first note of a scale. If you take a note that is not the tonic, find its dominant, the fifth note above it, and build a chord as if that note were the tonic, you get a secondary dominant chord. For example, in C major, take G, the fifth note of the scale. Find the dominant of G major, which is D. If G were the tonic, D would be a major chord instead of a minor. So when you use a major chord on the second degree of a major scale, you create a secondary dominant. Secondary leading tone chords are diminished chords built on a chromatic, non-scale note that leads to a chord a half step above it. In other words, these chords are used to create smooth voice leading by chromatically approaching the next chord. For example, in C major, if we have F and G, which are a major second apart, we could raise the F to F sharp, a half step, and build an F sharp diminished chord. This F sharp diminished chord functions as a secondary leading tone, creating tension and resolving to G major chord and temporarily tonicizing it. The Neapolitan chord is a major chord built on the lowered second degree. In A minor, this is a B flat major chord. Often used in classical music, it creates a rich, dramatic effect. Chromatic mediant chords are built on the third or the sixth degree and contain chromatic notes. Remember, the third degree of a scale is the mediant and the sixth is the submediant. More precisely, any note, a major or minor third from the root is a mediant, but if it doesn't belong to the scale, it's a chromatic mediant note. So an E major chord is a chromatic mediant chord in C because G sharp is outside the scale. Likewise, an E flat major chord is also a chromatic mediant chord because E flat itself is outside the scale. Modal interchange means borrowing chords from a parallel scale or mode. Parallel refers to the starting note being the same, but the scales or modes are different. For example, a diminished chord on the second degree in a major key is a good example of modal interchange. In this case, the chord is borrowed from the parallel minor scale. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that the MIDI files and project files for these pieces are available on my Patreon page for supporters, just like all the MIDI and project files for my YouTube videos. If you find my content helpful and interesting, please consider supporting the channel. Thank you! I composed two pieces to demonstrate how to create piano music. First, let's take a look at the sheet music. As you can see, there are two clefs, treble and bass, and the two staves are connected with a brace. This is called the grand staff. Piano music is typically written using a grand staff. The upper staff is played by the right hand and the lower by the left. In piano sheet music, dynamic markings are usually placed between the staves of the right and left hand parts. For smooth dynamic changes, we usually use a so-called hairpin. If the hairpin opens to the right, it indicates a crescendo, meaning the music gets louder, and if it opens to the left, it indicates a decrescendo, meaning the music gets softer, following the dynamic markings before and after the hairpin. In the sheet music, the pad marking indicates when to press the sustain pedal. The asterisk shows where to release it. The sustain pedal is the right pedal on a piano. It lets the notes ring out even after you release the keys, creating a smoother and more connected sound. The number of notes a pianist can play simultaneously is limited. Typically, each hand can handle 3 or sometimes 4 notes, but playing 4-note chords is already challenging, and quick changes between complex chords can be impossible. This is important to keep in mind when writing piano pieces. The happy piano piece is in G major, and the time signature is 3/8. The tempo is 120 BPM. I chose this time signature for a reason. 3/8 is an upbeat and quite fast-paced meter. It's similar to 3/4, but because of the 8 notes, it usually sounds faster and more joyful. 3/8 is a simple triple meter, just like 3/4. The piece is full of passing tones. For example, you can find them in the first, fifth and seventh measures. The other interesting phenomenon is the major chord on the second degree, A major. This is a so-called secondary dominant. Normally there is a minor chord built on the second degree of a major scale. We discussed the secondary dominant chords earlier in this video. The sad music piece is in G minor with a 6/4 time signature and a tempo of 110 BPM. 6/4 is a compound tuple meter like 6/8, but it's usually slower and more melancholic. If you want to write a really sad music piece, consider these pieces of advice. Choose a relatively slow tempo. 3/4 or 6/4 time signatures are excellent for sorrowful pieces. Use minor and diminished chords more often than major chords. The major chord on the 5th degree of the melodic minor scale sounds amazingly sad in the right context. So if your piece is in natural minor, borrow this major chord from the parallel melodic minor somewhere in your piece. Don't forget this is called modal interchange because a chord is borrowed from a parallel scale.